We're very, very lucky to be able to talk to Edwin today, and he's going to take us through the Scrum Guide changes. So Edwin, I've known Edwin since before I came to New Zealand. I think he was one of the first people that interviewed me, if I'm not mistaken. We worked together for just a short while, and I'm hoping I'm not the reason he left, but he's doing great things. Edwin has worked with Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber. You know, he's been in this world a long, long time. So I'm not trying to age you, Edwin, but just saying, you've been around the block.
Right here.
He is also a Scrum.org trainer. And yeah, we're very, very excited to have him. So thank you, Edwin, and welcome to Agile Auckland.
Thank you, Beth. Okay, let's get underway. So look, we're going to have a bit of a chat today about the Scrum Guide changes. I sort of got a confession to start with. When I first looked at the Scrum Guide changes, and I heard a lot about them, but being part of Scrum.org, there was a lot of communication and a lot of discussion. And when I first looked at them, I was pretty busy, but I also kind of looked and went, they don't seem to be like that big. But the interesting thing is, as I've delved into them more and more, and in particular, as I've prepared for this presentation, I've really had to think about them. And what I've found is they are very subtle and nuanced, but they're actually quite powerful and I think quite important. And hopefully I can communicate that to you guys tonight. These are sort of largely the way I interpret them. The way I've prepared for tonight is to read as much as I can of Jeff's thinking behind them and Ken's thinking behind them, so I can really kind of understand what were they thinking and why did they make these changes. As Beth mentioned, I did my original study under Jeff and brought him out here to New Zealand 12 years ago, 11 years ago. So yes, over a decade ago, I got to tour with Jeff. And through that, I got to really understand the man's thinking. Sitting at dinner with him, going all over New Zealand, I got to hear some of his philosophy and story behind how he created some of the initial thinking behind Scrum. And then I've also had the pleasure of and understanding his perspective and angle that he's brought to Scrum as well. So I've sort of tried to interpret some of these changes through their eyes and through reading their thoughts on why they made these changes to the guide. The other thing to add is I'm trying some little bit of technology tonight. So I've embedded some polls into the presentation. So hopefully I don't get tripped up with a technical fail, but hey, we'll give it a go and inspect and adapt, right? So I think we'll start off with a poll. If my tech is going to work nicely for me. Let's start with us. What I'd like you to do is put yourself to slido.com. If you've got a mobile in front of you, you can just scan the QR code. The code for this poll is J242 as on screen. And we'll take a couple of minutes to get your answers. But what I'd like to know is at your place of work, assuming that you're doing some form of Agile, who sort of primarily develops the product backlog? Is it really the product owner that kind of does most of that? Is it the whole Scrum team is involved in that? Let's sort of see how the answers flow in. Okay, we've got 22 responses, 25. How many people we got in total online, Beth? Or Jim?
56.
56. All right, let's sort of wait till we've got answers from I don't know, 35, 40 or something. A few coming in. Okay, very, very interesting result of this poll. Something that warms my heart to see that actually the entire Scrum team are involved in the majority of producing the backlog. In all the years that I've been doing Scrum and training Scrum, it hasn't been like this. So it's really, really pleasing to see this level of change. Cool. Okay, so let's jump in. That's a bit of interesting data to start with, bit of a data point. So a quick introduction. I stumbled over Agile a very, very long time ago. I was a developer and I got promoted to being a project manager. And I kind of looked at the state of project management and I wasn't happy with it. I kind of felt like there had to be a better way of doing product development, and started following my nose and sniffing around and found this weird thing called the Agile Manifesto, and some of the first papers published on Crystal by Alistair Coburn and XP and Scrum, and started trying to apply pieces of it. Failed dismally in a number of different places. Back then, the world was very anti-agile and very project management. I got told that this stuff would never work and it was irresponsible and unprofessional and all those types of things, but I stuck with it. Throughout my career, I've built up and sold a couple of companies. Probably the better known one was Claris. I built up Claris to be a blank canvas in which I could just apply some of these techniques without being inhibited by bosses to tell me it wouldn't work. And through my time at Claris, I brought Jeff out to New Zealand and toured with him and got to know him, and got to meet Ken. I joined Scrum.org back then as well, trainer number 8 to join Ken at Scrum.org. Which was a really, really interesting journey watching that organization. There's now over 300 trainers that have been handpicked around the world, and to watch Scrum.org go through that journey over the years has been really, really interesting. I've worked with a lot of different people over the years. As part of my membership at Scrum.org, I have to go back to typically either the States or to Europe every year. Obviously not so much anymore. And through that, I've got to go to a lot of different conferences and meet different people. And I've brought lots of them out to New Zealand, like Jeff Patton here, and Goiko Adzik has become a dear friend of mine. And so, yeah, it's been a real privilege sort of to get some of the thinking of those people and what they bring to the Agile community as well. I'm a co-founder at Radically with my business partner, Dan Teo. We formed Radically 3 years ago to focus on Agile into the business space. We could see a lot of organizations looking at how could they become more adaptive and Agile, not just in software, but across their entire organization. And we founded Radically to be able to help them do that transformation journey and support them. I'm a family man. I got 3 sons and a grown-up daughter, and I live on a farm up here in Warkworth. And as you can see from this picture, I trust my kids. There's my middle boy, George, when he was a bit younger, hoisting me up in the air with the tractor to pick pears. And the farm gives me a lot of pleasure and a lot of headspace. I was president of this fantastic organization, Agile Auckland, for 5 years, and really loved my time working there. But probably the thing I'm the most famous for is I'm the world's largest Oompa Loompa. This photo went around on the internet, and it's a true photo of me dressed as a gigantic Oompa Loompa about to go to a fancy dress party. So yeah, don't be afraid if I start breaking into song. Okay, so there's my introduction. What I'd like to do is just do a really short history of the Scrum Guide so that we build some context of why does the thing even exist? What's the role it plays? And I've been able to sort of witness the journey of Scrum for quite some time. And I think the Scrum Guide has played a very, very important part, not just in Scrum, but in Agile full stop. And so it's important we understand like where it's come from and why it exists. So this is a very, very interesting diagram that was presented in Karlsruhe in Germany, one of the sort of tech centers in Germany, a presentation by Jim Copeland. And he sort of shows the routes that lead up to the Agile Manifesto. How did we get to a bunch of guys getting together and creating this manifesto that's had such a profound shift on the world of work? And if you look at the routes, there's some pretty profound and dated routes that led all the way in here. And one of the ones that's very interesting is Scrum predated the manifesto by 8 years. Jeff's original work, right back in 1993, and then Ken joining him to support him and help him with that, dates back quite some time, even before extreme programming. So Scrum's had quite a profound impact on Agile and the manifesto. Its roots really come from the new product development game from Takeuchi and Nonaka in the Harvard Business Review article, and then even back to Toyota Production Systems and object-oriented programming back a long way. So I thought that might be of interest to you, to some of you. If you think about it, 1993, at a couple of years, we'll be coming up 30 years old for Scrum. That's quite some time. And Jeff Sutherland shared this article, this screenshot with me quite some time ago, right back in 2010, that sort of shows how we managed to come up, what was happening before the Agile Manifesto. So Kent Beck, one of the creators of extreme programming, reached out to him right back in 1995 and said, hey, I hear you're working on something similar to what we're thinking about around extreme programming. Can we have a chat? I want to steal as many of your ideas. So this concept of collaborating and working on lightweight methods goes back quite some time. So for me personally, I credit Jeff with a lot of the roots, and certainly a lot of my understanding of Scrum. So what I'd like to do is, unfortunately, streaming video over Zoom kind of sucks. So what I'm going to do is grab this link and post it into the chat. And what I'd like you to do is just have a quick watch of this video. I think it goes for about 4 or 5 minutes. I'd like you to have a look at this because it gives us a fair bit of context around Jeff's thinking that will sort of help explain some of the changes in the Scrum Guide. It all sort of joins it back together. So I've just popped that into the chat window. If you can have a click on that and then join us back here when you're done, and we'll continue on.
Well, the reason we have Scrum is because I came into software development from medical school. I've done research, complex adaptive systems. And as I learned come apart technologies, and as I looked at the way they were managing projects, I realized developers were always late, management was always under pressure, pressure on developers. So they would put on developers, the later the project would get. The whole thing was designed in such a way that the stable state of the system was not. In order to do that, we had to change the whole dynamics. What we knew from research with our labs is that we had to have very few roles in the team who's doing software development, specialized silos of activity, slow down communications. One of the first things we did was we set it up. We only had a team. We had a team. We read a paper by 2 Japanese business school professors on the best teams in the world. They described how best product development, new product development, set up how the teams are motivated, set up the team just like that. The team wanted to know what we call the team leader. We call them the Scrum Master. Then got the roles simplified, streamlined, moved out all the system. very quickly found we needed a person we called the product owner in addition to Scrum Master, who was responsible for clearly specifying the backlog and the right ordering, so when we ship the product, it would really take the market as a product. So we have the product owner, the Scrum Master. We then turned our attention to meetings because in order to build software fast, we cannot have people go into meetings all the time. They're wasting a lot of time. So we asked, what are the minimal meetings we need to have for Scrum? We knew we needed to deliver software in short cycles, no more than 4 weeks. Probably the majority of the teams now are 2-week sprints. So we needed a meeting at the beginning of the sprint to define, okay, what are we going to pull from the product backlog into that 2-week cycle? How are we going to implement it, track it? Meeting at the beginning of the cycle. We also knew, because again, a research done by the labs, the highest performing teams were driven by daily meetings. So we knew we had to have a daily meeting. We wanted it to be a really short meeting and cut it down to no more than 15 minutes. And in that meeting, everybody on the team needs to know what everybody else has been doing, what they're going to do next, and how they can help one another move really fast. So it's like a huddle in a football game, but a little bit more. At the end of the sprint, model that we had started Scrum, I had worked in a previous company, Imperial Empiricism, and their motto was demo or die. So at the end of every sprint, we're going to demo real working software to people who would use the software and get their feedback, because it's the feedback cycle that tends to really make development fast. So now we're down to 3 meetings, a meeting at the beginning of the sprint, a meeting at the end. We then turned our attention to the reporting, because one of the problems with software development is they do a lot of reporting. A lot of it is in the form of Gantt charts. And Gantt charts are always incorrect, because the Gantt chart is made and then things change and then the Gantt chart is incorrect. So it's very hard to plan about things. I looked at that and I said, the problem with these teams finishing a 2-week cycle per time is similar to trying to land an aircraft on the ground. For 11 years, I've been a fighter pilot. So we institute what I call the burn down chart. How fast is the team going? How much is left during the sprint before touchdown? Headed in the right direction? And just watching them trying to land the sprint is the way we wanted it. We put that up on the wall so that Scrum would be self-reporting. If anybody wanted to see the state of Scrum, they could have to do reporting. So on that wall is evolved into product backlog we're working on, each task that implementing backlog, the burn down chart that has tasks that we worked on across the wall. From needing to be done, and then a working state, and testing. So now we have completely streamlined the roles, the meetings, and the reporting became self-reporting. That set the stage for the really high-performing teams that we like to see.
Okay. So hopefully everyone has watched that video now. So look, the reason I wanted you to watch that video partially was to help you understand like the original thinking that Jeff came up with trying to solve this problem, but also for you to understand his philosophy and background. So Jeff had spent time in cancer research. He's a PhD, and he'd been doing a lot of work in, and you heard it in that video, he's talking around complex adaptive systems. So the idea of complex adaptive systems, very similar to models of nature. Think about a flock of birds. There's a flock of birds in New Zealand, the godwits that fly from Golden Bay, from Farewell Spit, all the way to Siberia every year. It's a complex adaptive system because they can't plan everything in advance. They don't know the weather patterns. They don't know where their source of food's going to be. They don't know whether they're going to get attacked. And they have to continually adapt and move and change their plan based on the variables that are flowing in from the system in which they're participating. And complex adaptive systems are very, very common in nature, and there's a lot of research done in there. And so a lot of what Jeff was trying to bring to the world of software was complex adaptive systems thinking. And you can hear his philosophy in there. And those of you that have studied the Cynefin framework would know this, that when we're dealing with a complex system, one of the best approaches we can take to dealing with that is simplicity, not more complexity. We don't deal with complexity with more complexity. We deal with complexity with simplicity. And you can see it in his thinking that he said, let's go for the minimum roles that we need. Let's go with the minimum meetings we need. They started with the absolute blank sheet of paper, threw everything out the door, and said, only add in what's necessary. And so there was a lot of the thinking that has pervaded Scrum throughout. Into this guy, Ken Schwaber. Ken was looking at empirical process control. That was his big thing. And empiricism would be familiar to a lot of you with science. In science, we have an idea about the world, we construct a hypothesis, we run an experiment, we test the results of that experiment, and we use the outcomes of the experiment to inform what we might do next. So empiricism is an age-old thing, core part of science. And through the 90s, Ken and Jeff collaborated and then finally released Scrum in 95, Austin, Texas at the UPSLA conference. Ken's famous for founding the Agile Alliance. He then founded the Scrum Alliance and then founded Scrum.org. So he's played a really, really critical role in this, published a lot of books, etc., and helped bring Scrum to market. But the challenge leading up until 2010, when the Scrum Guide first was published, is Scrum was fragmenting badly. I know when I learned it, back then, before Scrum.org existed, anyone who became a trainer could train Scrum, and there were no checks and balances on what they were training. And what resulted was a proliferation of different versions of Scrum throughout the world. So, for example, some people were going, Scrum mandates burn down charts. You have to do burn down charts. And other people were going, no, it doesn't. And then there are all these arguments, and people would go, well, what is Scrum? Because there wasn't a definition. And the whole world of Scrum started to fragment and fall apart. And so to deal with that issue, ta-da, along came the Scrum Guide. Because Ken and Jeff realized they needed to codify this by the two people that wrote it so that everyone knew what it is and isn't, and we could remove these silly arguments. So it was published first in 2010, and we're on to the 6th revision. And if you look at the history of the Scrum Guide, throughout those years, it's got increasingly smaller. So we go back to the philosophy of Jeff and Ken, that the way we deal with a complex system is with simplicity, not more complexity. Therefore, the Scrum Guide has got smaller and smaller and tighter to the barely minimal sufficient group of rules necessary for us to be able to inspect and adapt and use some common sense. A lot of the changes throughout the years, I've had to be across them all as a trainer because the training material changes. And so I've learned the nature of those changes well. And what I've seen is that a lot of the changes come down to some nuances of language, because people have this funny ability to misinterpret language, especially English. So as an example, we used to use the word commitment in earlier versions of the Scrum Guide. We would say, when we're doing sprint planning, the team would say, yep, we commit that to doing this work. And what was meant with commit was we commit to best endeavors and following this course of action. But of course, what business people heard with the word commit was, great, I've got a guarantee that at the end of the sprint, I'm going to get working product. Hurrah! And so the word commit was changed because of that type of misinterpretation. Same as the word grooming was changed to refining because grooming has a funny second meaning. So there's been a lot of work over these years to have a feedback loop back into the Scrum Guide to update it. Hence, the latest release that just came out in November 2020. So there's a little bit of history on the Scrum Guide. Where has it come from? Where is it going? And a little bit of the background. Let's jump in on some of the actual changes and what they mean. So I've simplified it down into 5 key changes that I'm going to talk through tonight. There are a bunch more little bits and pieces. I'll do a little bit of a summary at the end, but largely a lot of stuff's been removed. I'll start with the sort of bigger changes first, and then go through to some of the more subtle, nuanced ones. Okay, so what I'm going to try and do is approach this from the angle of what is the problem that these changes are trying to solve. I've read all of Jeff's notes on the Scrum Guide changes. I've tried to do a lot of research and to understand this. And to me, I summarize the first problem that's trying to be solved here is there is fundamentally a lack of emergence and empiricism in product development in the world today. So you're probably thinking, what on earth does that mean? So let me try and sort of unpack that a little bit and be clear on what I mean. Scrum's built on emergence and empiricism. So I talked, Jeff was talking about complex adaptive systems. And what that basically means is emergence is in a complex adaptive system is when the solution to dealing with that type of work, it tends to emerge from the interaction of the components in the system. So the image I've put up here of Starling murmuring, you can see the structure of the system adapting and being very agile. It's very adaptive and changing. And the interesting thing about this is there is no centralized control. There are thousands of independent agents in the system, all managing to make micro changes and adapt themselves in a very emergent, rapid adaptive kind of way. So they've discovered the right solution through this continual interplay of feedback loops coming in all around them about what's going on. There's an important point in the roots of Scrum. The second, which is very much Ken's baby, is empiricism. And so empiricism is defined as using evidence to inform your ideas. So if we think around how that plays out in Scrum, we've got a theory around a product or an offering or a service or some work that we want to do. We believe that if we implement this, we'll save these dollars or we'll improve customer loyalty by X. So what we do is run an experiment. We use that experiment to test and learn, and we use the empirical data to inform what we might do next. And in essence, we continually inspect and adapt based on the transparency of the information that we have in front of us. Now, if you look at product development, a lot of product development these days still fails to truly leverage these two things. So let's have a quick dig into empiricism. If we think of other things that are built on empiricism, some good examples to help sort of cement the concept is think about driving. Right, driving, you have to have a continual feedback loop coming in about what else is going on around you so that you can make micro changes the whole time and change course. Likewise in sport, in order to win, we have to be able to see what the competitor's doing, understand what's happening, and reapply our strategy with micro changes in the moment. Same with most games, we have to look at what's going on and have a feedback loop to make continual changes. And on the analogies go. Science, sailing a boat from one point to another, the wind currents and the tides and all sorts of things change. And so we have to continue to adapt course. And increasingly, our business world is exactly in that same paradigm. That business is now unpredictable and we have to continually inspect and adapt. So if we look at how that plays out, back to my original point, the lack of emergence and empiricism in product development, what I see and through the world I live in is generally, I think a lot of people in product development and using Agile still fail to use emergence and empiricism effectively in what they're doing. And the symptoms that I see in that is very mechanical based Scrum and a lack of a definition of done and achieving done continually on an ongoing basis. So I want to unpack those 2 points a little bit to make my point of why I believe there's a lack of emergence and empiricism in product development. So there's a lot of organizations out there that do very, very mechanical Scrum. And the focus is on the framework itself. So we need to be awesome at Scrum, and people come to work to try and be awesome at Scrum. But they completely fail to forget that's not the point. The point is what it enables you to achieve, not excellence at the framework. What it manifests itself in is organizations focused on using Scrum and Agile techniques to just chuck out more widgets, not deliver more value, more valuable outcomes to customers, and adapt to those customers' needs. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with that situation. I'm sure you've been in environments where it's just about crank out more work faster. The second part is we're failing to use some of these techniques for creative problem solving. So a lot of organizations, there's just product backlogs are just a giant list of work to be done, and teams are there just to crank the handle and deliver all the work. Pretty much like a production line. And what it looks like is your team, the developers are just pretty much an execution unit, not a creative problem solving unit. And typically, product owners dictate what should be done, and developers just crank the handle and deliver. And the shame is that we know that complex problems are best solved by the interplay of all the people in the system, not just a couple of people defining a product backlog and then handing it off to a team to go and deliver, but through all the people involved, designing and running experiments and validating those experiments around what's valuable and what's important. So I believe mechanical Scrum is a major problem. The second one, around done, I want to run a survey on. So I'm going to challenge everyone. I would like you to please repeat what we did in the previous example. And I'd like you to think about, in the Agile teams you're in now, assuming you're in one, are you able to complete a done increment that's usable at least every sprint? Okay, so I ask this question every single time I run a Scrum course, and the answer is exactly what's up here. There are very few teams that are consistent and reliably delivering done work at least once per sprint, if not more often. Typically, in my experience, about 1 in 5. It's exactly what we've got up here. So if we look at what that lack of done means, if you distill Scrum right down, and in the scrum.org material, it's crystal clear on this, the whole point of Scrum is to deliver a done piece of work upon which we can inspect and adapt. That's what empiricism is. Because if we can have a done increment, then we can look at the increment and get feedback from other people. We can validate the hypotheses and the assumptions that people have made about the product, and we can get feedback and use that to change course accordingly. So it's the whole heartbeat of Scrum, and yet the reality is, without it, empiricism is extremely limited because people have no idea what they're actually inspecting. And done is utterly vital, but guess what? The definition of done has never been a core part of Scrum. Nowhere has it ever been a core mandatory part of the Scrum framework. So that's been a major challenge. We've never been able to really drive home, well, we've tried to drive home this point about done, but without the definition of done being a core part of the framework and having a home, it's been very difficult to achieve that. So as you can see, as we saw in the poll, not many teams can be done at least every sprint. So those are 2 major problems. So here is the first change in the Scrum guide. So now every artifact in Scrum, there are only 3. Each artifact now has a corresponding commitment to it. And in Scrum, the word commitment is not a guarantee, it's a course of action. So we'd all be familiar with this one. It's exactly the way Scrum's always been. That the sprint backlog has a sprint goal, and the reason we have that sprint goal is it gives context for the sprint. So we don't just select a bunch of work and then go, oh, we should come up with a goal. We come up with a goal for the sprint, and then we select work that aligns to that goal. What it allows us to do is means that the sprint backlog can be flexible, i.e. we can change the scope throughout the sprint, as long as we're always maintaining the focus on achieving the sprint goal. So a core part of Scrum. So what this latest Scrum Guide version has done is introduce the same concept for the product backlog. So rather than the product backlog just being a big list of stuff that we want to do, excuse me, what it now has is a product goal that forms part of the product backlog. And it's the exact same reason that we have a sprint backlog. It asks us, why are we making this? Well, what are we trying to achieve in the first place? What is the North Star? And what it means is the rest of the product backlog emerges and adapts and changes in order to hit that goal. The purpose is to achieve the goal, not just relentless execution of the activities. Exactly the same as the sprint goal, but for the product backlog. The next thing that the change and the problem it solves that I've just gone through is there was never a home for the definition of done. There now is. The definition of done is now the commitment of the increment. So when we say that we're delivering an increment in Scrum every sprint, what it means is that increment it complies with the definition of done. And so now the definition of done has a home. What that allows us to do is to increase transparency of what's being delivered at the end of the sprint, to look at that as a piece of usable product, and then from that to adapt what we might do next. So that's an important change. So those are probably a couple of the bigger changes. I think they make it quite clean, and they really help give a lot more context to the work we're doing, and they improve empiricism. So there's one change. The product goal itself, its objective is to try and give a single long-term objective for the overall product. So bear in mind, when we're working in a complex world, what we're after is we know where we want to go, but the way that we're going to get there is probably going to change. It's precisely what this is trying to achieve. It's describing a future state of where we'd like to be, and it allows the entire Scrum team to adapt the product backlog continuously to try and achieve that outcome. So we're trying to move away from this idea of just a big list of requirements to actually, hold on, what's the goal? Then let's break out work and refine and adapt it continually in order to achieve that goal. And I put in this quote here from Bezos: be stubborn on the vision, flexible on the details. It's precisely what it's trying to achieve. Okay, so the next challenge that's been really pervasive throughout the Scrum world. Earlier versions of Scrum always refer, and you heard Jeff say it in his video. That video was recorded quite some time ago when these earlier versions of Scrum existed. What we always had was 2 teams. We always referred to Scrum as 3 roles: a product owner, a Scrum master, a development team. And then the 3 of them together were referred to as the Scrum team. Now, what that created was, in essence, 2 teams. It created a development team within a Scrum team. And what that has led to is a bit of a us and them relationship, where the product owner sort of says, well, I set the direction, and the development team go, well, we just get told the direction and handed product backlog items from you, and we just execute. And unfortunately, again, it's failing to leverage the collective intelligence of the developers. It's treating them like a production line, and it's not asking them to participate in complex problem solving. It's using them as just doers. The second challenge is that over the years, the 3 roles have turned into job titles. So, and you would see it all the time. I did a bit of research for this talk. I had a look on TradeMe and Seek and Monster.com, and you just see the really relentless barrage of, we want a Scrum Master, and what the Scrum Master does is just this. And so what it ends up is this real, really strong demarcation of, no, you don't do that, you're a product owner. You don't do that, you're a Scrum Master. You don't do that, you're just a development team member. And it sort of led to this proliferation of people being employed as Scrum Masters, not necessarily as problem solvers. So the intention here was never to create 3 job titles. The intention was, as you could hear Jeff say in the video, we started with a blank sheet of paper. We looked at the minimally sufficient things necessary in order to be productive. Not jobs, but accountabilities necessary to be productive. So welcome to change number 2 in the Scrum Guide. Dropped. You can actually do a Control F on the Scrum Guide. The word role doesn't appear. They're now accountabilities. So basically throw your job title out the window. We don't care if you're a Scrum Master, don't care if you're a project manager, a team facilitator, an Agile coach. No one cares anymore. Not in the Scrum world. They're about the accountabilities that need to be filled in order to be successful. And then secondly, there is no development team anymore. It's one team called a Scrum team. And that's made up of the accountabilities of a Scrum Master, a product owner, and developers, not a development team. So it's quite an interesting change. Certainly the second part, the first part, the accountabilities, is something that we've been exploring at Radically for quite some time. We've been working with some companies that are saying to us, hey, we don't have Scrum Masters, how are we going to do this? And we've worked through what the accountabilities of a Scrum Master are and how those accountabilities can be filled, regardless of the sort of background of the person filling it. And we've worked on this philosophy as long as the accountabilities are filled, then we're succeeding. And we've found it very successful. It's been a very, very interesting way to work. And I'm really pleased to see the Scrum Guide sort of catch up. But a couple of comments here as I put this presentation together that I thought about. What it is going to require is for teams to sit down and actually have a decent conversation around who's going to do what and how we're going to work together. It's not just, you know, hey, my business card says I'm a Scrum Master, so therefore I do these things. We're actually going to have to chart successfully together. We're going to have to talk around how we work together. And we're going to have to continually discuss that to make sure we're clear on the accountabilities. And I think that's a very, very positive thing. And the second thing is it gives you a lot more flexibility around how those accountabilities are filled. For example, the Scrum Master accountabilities could be filled by a developer, and that's fine. That's not a big deal. So I'm going to pause for a moment and just see if there's any questions. I know I've done a lot of talking. Jim, have we got anything popping up that that sort of fits in with where we're at?
One of the things that springs to mind is, what about the training that's happening as well? So you're getting training for a Scrum Master, and it's not really accountability focused, is it? It's role focused at the moment. So the whole training and accreditation maybe even has to change, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good point. I've actually been training today on the latest version of the Professional Scrum Master class, which is updated for this version of the Scrum Guide. And yeah, we are rolling those changes through. I guess I can only comment from the scrum.org training angle. And I can also comment from Radically's angle. I think scrum.org has been leaning and heading this way for some time. So to me, like when we teach a Scrum Master class, we have been more talking around what does success in those accountabilities look like, rather than, you know, here's your job description, this is what you need to do to be successful. So for example, the first quarter of the entire Scrum Master class is very much around empiricism. and the sort of founding principles behind Scrum rather than the framework. And I think that's probably an important nuance, that it's actually understanding the philosophy and required to fill the accountabilities rather than looking at it as I'm coming on this course to become a role. But I hear you. Like at the moment, we've got Scrum Master training, Product Owner training, and I think we can adapt that to accountabilities. I think that's fine. But it certainly does create this sort of demarcation. So yeah, I tend to agree with you.
So one of the questions is related to that. Do you think people can have several accountabilities? So being a Scrum Master and wearing some other hats as well?
Yeah. Yes, I do. But the principles still come about that when you try to fill the Scrum Master accountabilities and the Product Owner accountabilities, you end up being a traditional manager. So if you think around how we tend to split work out, what we're trying to do here is say someone needs to set the direction for what we're going to try and achieve together. And so in Scrum, that's the Product Owner. And then someone else is going to help facilitate and work and coach the team. Now, if you merge those two things together, you end up with a traditional manager. So, i.e., someone who defines what you're going to work on and then gives you feedback and develops and, does the line management sort of part. And that's not healthy. We're trying to break that in the Agile world and split those out. So I would still maintain that you don't want to blend those two accountabilities, but absolutely it does mean other accountabilities can be blended. And I know from our day-to-day world at Radically, we run Radically with Holacracy as a dynamic operating model. And Holacracy is very, very interesting in that it doesn't believe in roles, it believes in accountabilities. And for example, I have a huge range of accountabilities that I fill at Radically. And those accountabilities are fluid. So if I get busy on something else, we might collectively in a very organic way redefine my accountabilities to be sitting with someone else, so that you're energizing accountabilities, not filling a role. Roles are very much job description. Accountabilities tend to be more fluid.
I'll just ask one more, which is reasonably popular from Slido. It's the notion of definition of done is often quite technical and often isn't reviewed that frequently. Does what is being proposed now mean that the definition of done could actually change from sprint to sprint?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, to me, the idea of the definition of done changing is an expectation anyway. It's not a set in stone document. It's an adaptive, fluid, living document that you are changing based on what you learn. So, for example, if you do a sprint and you learn that, hey, we let a defect out that we shouldn't have, well, you might want to revisit your definition of done. So it should change anyway. But secondly, certainly the way I've always done a definition of done is much more business focused. So I would suspect, and I'm guessing here with the person who asked the question, that their definition of done has probably been written by developers in terms of how do we know we're done technically. Whereas my view of a definition of done is the product owner needs to be involved in writing that definition of done. It's not just the developers that write it. It's an interface between us as product owner and developer, so that when a developer says to me as a product owner, we're done, we've got a common language that we're working to. So it's not just technical. Often product owners aren't technical. So to me, I tend to lean it, or would try to tease that definition of done a little bit more towards the business end than the technical end.
So it's the definition of done relating more to a sprint goal or increment goal rather than, I see definitions of done that often just relate to a user story. So definition of done means this user story is out of my life, kind of thing.
Totally. Well, if you think around the purpose of the increment is we need to look at the state of the work. And as the manifesto said, our primary measure of progress is working software. So in order for us to understand the true state of the software or the product, if it's not software, is by using it. So by seeing it and touching and feeling it, we know the true state of the product. So that's our inspect. So when we inspect it and can see it, then we can look and say, based on the true state of the product now, this is what I think we should be doing next, i.e. the adapt.
Right.
Now, your ability to do that is entirely based on how transparent that increment is, i.e. the definition of done is what helps us make that increment transparent. So if we don't have a definition of done, the product owner has no idea what they're inspecting, which means their ability to figure out what to do next is pretty much irrelevant. So it's so critical to empiricism, and this is why they've brought this change in, is to reinforce the empirical nature of product development.
Okay, well, I'll keep my eyes on the chat and also Slido, and we'll maybe come back to some of the questions, Edwin. There's some very good comments that Casper and Abigail and Dan have made in the chat about answering some of those things too, and reinforced some of what Edwin's been saying with maybe a different emphasis. So it's worth reading those as well.
I was expecting Casper and Dan to be sledging me. That's very generous of them.
Oh, I deleted that very quickly.
Cool. So there's the people-based changes. To me, quite interesting changes. I think they're actually quite far-reaching and profound. It's sort of really drawn point home. This is about, as Jeff start with a blank page, what are the bare minimal things needed to enable empiricism and emergence? And it's not fixed roles, it's accountabilities. Huge change in language. And the rationale behind the change in language of the Scrum Guide is, if you, like, when I look back, I've been across every change to the Scrum Guide, and I've looked at the nuances of the impact of the change in language. And I know it sounds really trivial and minor to argue over the meaning of a word, but unfortunately words do have meaning, and meaning translates into how we work. And so often when people take and read the Scrum Guide, they often misinterpret it. And that's because largely, certainly in my experience, when people are trying something new, they really love a recipe, and they sort of tend to over literalize the meaning of things. And that happens all the time with the Scrum Guide. People look at it and go, oh yeah, but the Scrum Guide says you're not allowed to do this, or the Scrum Guide says this, this, and this, and this. And unfortunately, that is just people reading between the lines, often due to the language not quite being concise or clear enough. So there's been a bit of tightening of the language. It's actually quite a considerable tightening of the language. So the sort of key points are, it's a lot simpler, clearer, and less prescriptive. It's sort of going right back to principles of Scrum, which is why I played the video at the beginning. And you can see what they're saying here. Like, what a great opening statement. The Scrum framework is purposefully incomplete. So if you think you're looking for a recipe, think somewhere else, because it's not a complete system. It expects you to have to add things based on your context and scenario. It says that it's only defining the parts required to implement the Scrum theory, which is empiricism and emergence. And you see, they're saying, rather than provide people with detailed instructions, the rules of Scrum guide their relationships and their interactions. So it's saying Scrum isn't going to solve your problems. It is going to give you a framework in which you can be empirical and inspect and adapt. And I think that's a very, very good thing, stepping away from that prescriptiveness. The second thing is, it's targeted now at a much, much wider audience, because people are applying Scrum well and truly beyond software and IT. So all the IT specific language is gone. It's now targeted really into a much sort of broader audience on like business language. It's shorter. And I snapped this example out of the two different guides. On the left is the previous version, on the right is the current. You can see here that they've just, like this previous one, you might not be able to see it over Zoom, but you can see the more prescriptive language. It goes, the development team usually starts by designing blah, 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 blah. This one is just way, way more less prescriptive. So it says, you know, for the selected product backlog item, the developers plan the work necessary. So it's been condensed. The Scrum Guide's now down to 10 pages. The previous version was 17. So there's a fair bit of that language has been stripped out, and it's bringing it back to principles rather than practices. And the good news is that gives us less fodder for Scrum Police. So I'm sure all of you have experienced the Scrum Police going, no, you're not allowed to do that because Scrum says. Thankfully, this is part of this change is to try and move away from that, because frankly, none of us want that. And it's not the intention ever of Scrum, but unfortunately, it is the way that in some cases it's been interpreted. Okay, another subtle change. They've gone whole hog. This whole debate of do we mean self-organizing, do we mean self-managing has been resolved. It's self-managing. We're basically saying the previous version here said self-organizing teams choose how to best accomplish their work. They're now saying self-managing, that basically you've got a goal, figure out yourself as a team on who does what. It's not that you organize yourself, it's that you actually manage all your own day-to-day activities. Subtle, but again, important change. Change number 5, a lot of stuff stripped out. The 3 questions for the daily Scrum are gone. And I know from talking to Ken over the years, it's been a real source of frustration. The purpose of the daily Scrum has never been a status meeting. It's a planning meeting in which we look at our status today based on the work we've done so far. And based on the status of where we are today, we figure out what we're going to do for the next 24 hours. In other words, we replan continually in order to hit the sprint goal. Now, the 3 questions, unfortunately, had a habit of turning us into a status meeting. So in the last 24 hours, I've done this, this, and this. Before the next daily Scrum, I will do this, this, and this. No impediments. Report done. And then we'd move on. That's a fail. So to try and really bring home that this is a planning meeting, the whole guidance around questions that you might use to manage a daily Scrum are out the window, which I think, again, is a very, very healthy thing. The word roles, 100% gone. It's now accountabilities. Another subtle change is previously the wording had the sprint review led only by the product owner, which again led to that us and them. Now it's saying the sprint review is done by the entire Scrum team. And I think, again, that's a really important part to play, because they're actually saying here that not only do the Scrum team participate in the development of the product backlog, i.e. we develop the solution together, that we're also saying the Scrum team participate in the inspect and adapt at the end of the sprint and the sprint review. And I've talked around the other sort of 2 subtle changes, no team within a team and the IT language removed. Okay, so what we're going to do is hear from you guys. Let me try and get this Jamboard link into the chat. I'm really keen to hear from you guys to do a bit of a brainstorm into what do these changes actually mean for you? Do you think they're going to have any impact on your day-to-day work? Are they just a bit meh? Like really, or do you feel like can you see some of the subtleties in them? Really interested to hear what you guys come up with. Let's try and get a browser window up. And
Edwin, we're going to put them in breakout rooms for this, right?
Yes, thank you, Beth, for the reminder. So Beth's going to pop you into breakout rooms. What we'd like you to do is in your breakout rooms, because we've only got one board here, in your breakout rooms, discuss and see if you can come up with a bit of a theme. Because if every single person on the call tonight puts a post-it up here, we're going to end up with a bit of a dog's breakfast. So try and just pop up maybe 1 or 2 themes of what you discussed per group, and let's see what sort of picture emerges.
Yeah, definitely. So teams, I'm just about to put you into breakout groups, but you have the ability to come back to the main presentation at any time, but we're anticipating about 8 minutes. So thanks, everyone. Here we go.
Okay, Zoom has conveniently turned itself into a panel.
I'm just going to use the time, Edwin, while we are waiting. I had a question, I really like the new changes. One question I had about the product goal. How do you set a product goal if you are not working with the software team, if you are working with other delivery team?
Yeah.
And
Vintage Scrum.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Am I silent? Am I no?
Stop
Cool.
sharing. Oh no, there we go. Sorry, you're good. You're good. Sorry.
So Vintage Scrum, like I said, it's purposefully incomplete. They don't prescribe how you do it, but they tell you you need to do it because it's important. So I think in a lot of ways, the product goal is really how you choose to do that is down to you, so that you can do it within the context of your situation, whether it's software or marketing or whatever you're doing. I know I've always been a very goal-driven person, and I've done a lot of consulting work with product owners. And one of the tools I heavily use is impact mapping, because it's very, very goal-driven, and it helps you define goals that are very business-focused rather than lists of requirements. It allows you to focus on impacts and outcomes that you're trying to make from a very business outcome perspective. So to me, what I'm planning when I have to start coaching people to be using product goals is quite an extensive use of impact maps.
Oh, thank you.
No worries. Hey, let's get some engagement going.
Yeah,
Does anyone, can we, cool. Thanks, Beth. Let's close the room.
60 seconds.
And in the meantime,
yeah.
Okay. Why don't we, is there someone here, maybe we can get one of you guys who's back in the main room here to start explaining to us one of your post-its up here and give us an overview of maybe the discussion that happened in your group, and yeah, a bit about how you think the changes will affect you.
I'm going to go first.
Cool.
We are the pink stickies to the right-hand side. We'll challenge accountabilities and roles, and also the simple language one. We actually put 2 of those up. We had a good discussion around how people traditionally haven't taken the accountability and I'm paraphrasing the words here, of course, but people have focused more on what their role was rather than the accountability. So when it's come to things like sprint reviews, for example, the team has sat back and let the product owner do it, where this is going to actually challenge them to think about how they restructure their accountabilities for what they're trying to achieve, which I think is really, really cool. And the second part was about the language, simple language. I'm very passionate personally about what you called the Scrum police. And I've been known to say a time or two, hang on, it's a 19-page document. How can you say that it defines all our processes? So the simple language and actually breaking it down a little bit further is going to remove that room for confusion.
Yeah, those are really, really nice insights, Jodie. I really like that. And I mean, from my perspective, I've always had like a really been fortunate to actually understand the philosophy because I got to talk to Ken and Jeff. But I think unless you've actually spent time with them and you just read older versions of the Scrum Guide, you might. You can kind of see how it's easy to misinterpret it. So to me, like bringing this language back to principles, I think is vitally important.
Absolutely. What drives your behavior in the team, right?
Yeah, totally. That's really nice. Anyone else from another team want to share some of the insights that you guys came out with?
I'll go for my team if that's all right. We put up the 2 blue ones. We had a discussion again about the Scrum police, and it all been a lot simpler and the language better. But the 2 things we picked out were the idea of having a product goal. We think that's a brilliant idea, and the removing of the 3 questions. Puts the focus back on the planning rather than it just being a status update and stuff like that. So yeah, I think those were the 2 ones that that we thought were the best ones.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. Awesome, thanks, Iggy.
Our team, both the other members of the team were actually more of a non-IT area, and they thought that the new Scrum Guide suited application to the non-IT area a lot better and was going to be easier to translate into that. Coming from an education area, the thing I really loved, students want a recipe and then be examined on this recipe, which I'm constantly fighting and trying to interrupt their thinking. So I really loved the focus on goals and outcomes and increments, not the process, and ask these 3 questions. And so that change of focus to me is a really big one. And, you know, I think that will help to stop some of that mechanical Scrum happening.
Yep. Great. I mean, look, the number of teams I've worked with over the years that are kind of like feature factories, that's the words they actually use. They go, we just have a backlog of stuff and we just sit here cranking the handle all day. And I mean, that's not building empowerment and engagement and collective intelligence to solve problems. So this sort of move to one Scrum team and a goal that they're working towards, I think they're subtle changes, but I think they're very, very profound.
Hey, Edwin. So I'll just go from our room as well. So what I put up there, someone in our room thought that there could have been an opportunity for Ken and Jeff to probably also look at the name developer and change it, especially for non-IT guys, you know, because the word came from that IT background. Do you want to probably, I mean, we had different thoughts around that. Maybe if you want to just help, you know, what's your thoughts?
Yeah. Look, it actually doesn't come from IT. Scrum's roots are product development, and that's what's meant by developer, this product developer, not software developer. But I hear you. It's got a connotation. I mean, I have to do it every time I teach a course. I have to explain to people it doesn't mean software developer. And you know, if you want to simplify language, that would be a nice one to simplify. But yeah, look, I hear you. I guess, look, at the end of the day, you know, that's sort of in their hands. But yeah, I tend to agree with you. I prefer not to use the word developer. Any other comments or thoughts from any of the teams out there?
I see one on the board that seems quite interesting. It's not from my group, but the worry about job prospects. Will Scrum Masters be unwanted if devs can do the work instead? Yeah, and I must admit, like, I was lying there last night as I drifted off to sleep thinking about the different questions I might get, and I knew that one would come up, and I actually do think it's real. But at the same time, if there's one thing we know in our modern world is that no job stays the same forever, and that in our careers we must be adaptive and we must learn to continually change. I still think that people with an agile mindset who can help guide organizations through learning these techniques like empiricism and emergence are always going to be in demand, whether their title is Scrum Master or not. I would say broaden your horizons though, beyond just, you know, having your PSM and calling yourself a Scrum Master. Like, broaden your horizons out to you know, where you can see Scrum going. Right, this is heading into business. I would be thinking around things like learning a bit more about product ownership, learning a bit more about leadership and culture and the types of environments that we need in order to be successful in this volatile, changing world. And if you become a master of that, you're always going to be in demand, regardless of whether you call yourself a Scrum Master or something else. So I do think this narrow concept of, you know, and like I said, preparing for this, I jumped on Trade Me Jobs and Seek. And, you know, there is just pages of Scrum Master jobs and product owner jobs.
And I do think that that's going to morph a little bit, probably not, as a result of these changes overnight, but I think in general that the trend is heading that way anyway. So as long as you become someone who can help organizations adapt, I don't think you're ever going to have to worry about whether you're unwanted. Okay, just conscious of time, we're butting up against 7 o'clock. I'll just head back to the material and wrap up. So, look, to say a final word, Scrum is just a minimally sufficient framework. It's designed for solving complex work. So work that has those unknown unknowns, and we need to use the concept of emergence and empiricism. And remember, it's been designed to be purposefully incomplete. So Scrum will never tell you how to write a product backlog item. It'll never tell you how to write a product goal. It'll never tell you how to write a sprint goal. And it's purposefully incomplete so that you can adapt it to lots of different domains and scenarios. It always works best with an organization that can set goals and then have the faith that the right solutions will emerge via interaction of a bunch of smart people working together. It's always going to be the belief of Scrum. It's baked into the philosophy of Ken and Jeff. And so I'd leave you with the thought that Scrum hasn't really changed. It's what it's always been. But what they've done is they've tried to make their thinking and their philosophy a lot clearer so that the message can be broadcast more broadly than to people who have the privilege of having worked with them. And to me, I think it's a very, very important and valuable change. I've put in a shameless plug here, but I'm just going to move on from that. This is kind of what I do. I teach people this stuff. But to wrap up, thank you. Read the latest version. It's free. It's only 10 pages now. Go and grab a copy, read it, get your head around the changes. There's some good blogs out there and some good information. There's a lot of blah, blah, but stuff from Jeff and Ken is good. It's worth reading. And if you want to discuss the changes or you want to talk to me, my details are on here. And I think we're recording this, so you'll be able to track me down. You can always find me on LinkedIn. But yeah, thank you for making the time tonight, and I hope you've learned a thing or two.
Nice. Thank you, Edwin, and thank you for everyone for participating. Just a few closing remarks. Our next event is March 17th. It'll be a panel discussion on the lessons of 2020. We're doing this in partnership with Business Agility. And then March 25th, we'll be back at Genesis to learn about their Junior Scrum Master program, which totally ties into this event tonight. So Edwin, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I know I learned some things. Hopefully you all did too. And if you have any questions, yes, reach out to Edwin directly. I think we are going to wind up, but please reach out. You have his email. And as always, we have our Slack channel, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube. This will be posted on YouTube as soon as we can do some editing. Thank you all. And, we'll see you in person next month. Pizza, beers, drinks, March 17th.
Adios.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
See you guys.
Thanks all.